We have a 1910 Stanley Steamer Model 60. It's a 10 horsepower steam car built in Newton, Massachusetts. Um, the basic configuration of the cars is that it's a roadster, meaning that it has a single seat in the back. No doors, obviously. In 1910, they weren't really necessary. Soon found to be necessary by about 1912. Interesting things about the car: the entire body is made out of wood. The body is made out of ash with poplar sides. The wheels are made out of hickory. And in an original configuration, the poles that hold the axles together are made out of hickory as well. The rest of the car, the fenders are metal, the hood, and the undercarriage parts, the axles, the springs obviously are metal. And of course, there's a lot of different metals in this car that you might not see on a modern car. A lot of brass, a lot of bronze, certainly steel. So there's a number of different things about these cars that are different than modern cars that you might, or even other cars of the era, being that it's a steam car. The lighting system on the car is run by acetylene gas and with this press-the-light bottle that's on the side of the car. The headlights are gas. The oil lamps for the side lights are oil lamps. The tail light is an oil lamp, so they have a font on the bottom that holds oil, and you'd light those with a match as you would the headlights when you needed them. This car also, because it's a steam car, has another function for the press-the-light, and that is there's a torch in the front that you would use to light the burner to boil the water to make steam. So that's why there's two valves on the press-the-light tank, where normally on a gas car you might only see a single line going to the press-the-light bottle. Under the hood, there's a boiler. The boiler is a fire tube boiler. A fire tube boiler means that the tubes are basically flues that carry the flames from the burner up through the tubes, exhausting out the exhaust stack, and it creates a very large heating surface so that you could boil the water much more efficiently. This type of boiler, the water is, if you will, around the tubes. The tubes are basically, we'll call them stay bolts, but they're hollow stay bolts that are flues. The burner in this car is a drilled burner, so it has about 4,800 number 53 drilled holes, number 53 drill size, so a very small hole, and the fuel would go through these holes under pressure and ignite on top of a cast iron grate and then be drawn up through the tubes of the boiler. This car should run at somewhere around 450 to 500 psi steam pressure, which is very high pressure if you're from the train world or any other type of steam industrial application. It's very high pressure, but it works well with the Stanley, and it's engineered to work within the system and make the car go down the road at a reasonable speed. Headlights on a car of this era might not have been a component that came with the car as standard option. It was an accessory. On this car, the Rushmore headlights were made by the Rushmore Dynamo Works. They were an accessory item to the car in 1910. And it was something that somebody could opt for if they wanted, and they're acetylene, so that is the same kind of gas that a plumber might use to solder pipes in your house, and it's in a bottle on the running board, and you would have to open the door to light the burner inside and crack the gas over at the valve, and a flame would ignite, and the flame would be reflected in the lens in the back, on mirror in back, and through the lens in front. The side lights on the car were a standard component to the car when it was made new in 1910. And it's kind of interesting because the standard lights on this car, as most cars in the era, would run on oil. So these are oil lamps. There's a font on the bottom, and there's a chimney on the top, and there's a wick. And you would open the door on the side of the light, and you could light the wick, and you'd have side lights. Like I said, the headlights were an accessory, so that was something that was an added feature, which many people opted for. You'll notice that there's another small light, which is very similar to an early bicycle lamp, because that's exactly what it is. And this is the dash lamp, because in this car you'd need to be able to see the gauges. to monitor the steam pressure and the fuel pressure and the oil going to the engine and and water, obviously water to the boiler. This car came standard with a bulb horn, which the bulb is on the other side. It's a rubber bulb, and when you squeeze the bulb, air would run down the tube and honk the horn. It's a Rube's horn, another thing that was made by a secondary manufacturer, as on most cars. The tank on the running board of this car is a Prestolite tank, and a Prestolite is a fuel tank, but it's a fuel tank that runs the headlights. So this tank is under pressure, and it has acetylene gas in it, and that's what runs down the red tubing through these valves to the headlights, which you would have to manually light at the front of the car. It also serves another purpose in that there's a torch at the front of the car that you could also light the burner with. This is the torch that you would use to light the burner using the acetylene from the Prestolite bottle. So on a steamer, it has two functions. On an internal combustion car, it would generally only be running the lights. The lever on the side of the car is the emergency brake lever. It has a ratchet, and when you're parked, you would pull the ratchet up, and you could also use it if in a panic mode to stop the car if your brakes failed or if you felt like you needed more braking. These cars originally had mechanical brakes, and sometimes you needed to use both if you're going down a steep hill here in New England. On the side, also the car, on the same driver's side of the car, there's a water glass. That tells you how much water you have in the water tank, which is underneath the seat. Next to it is a valve which relieves condensate from the engine, from the cylinders in the engine, and you could reach down and open this up and drain water out, because you wouldn't want to push water, which doesn't compress, in the cylinders when you're running. So you could drain that condensate out. And then when you're running and everything is warm, you'd close it back up and the steam would push the pistons back and forth. Here on the side of the car, there's a monogram, which is sort of a common thing that you would see back in the day on your car. Most of the people that would own something like this were fairly well-heeled, and it was a very large purchase that they were proud of, and monograms were sort of in fashion, and they were in fashion for quite a while, from this era right on through, even up to the 60s. Today they aren't seen as often on cars, but I think it's a nice touch, and for this owner, we put his initial on the side with the laurel wreath. On the rear of the car, there's a oil lamp that's similar to the oil lamps on the side of the car, except that this one has a red, a green, and a clear lens. The clear lens shines on the license plate. This license plate's a 1910 license plate, and the car resides in Michigan, and so this car is actually registered with this license plate in the state of Michigan. The red faces to the rear, the green faces to the side. Other interesting points about the car: this is the rear axle assembly on the car, and the engine is connected directly to it. This big black stack is the exhaust stack, which has two purposes. One is it forms a chimney for the burner in the front, and the steam comes out of it that exhausts out of the engine, which helps the draft. So it's sort of a forced draft when this car is steaming down the road. This is the power plant for the car. So this is the boiler area, which is obviously under the front of the car. What we have is a burner underneath a boiler, and the associated plumbing that routes fuel to the burner and water to the boiler. This is the throttle lever, which sends the steam from the boiler to the engine. And as you push this up, you send the steam to the engine, which pushes the cylinders back and forth and makes the wheels go. The throttle is this small valve with the white insulated pipe coming from it. And when you open the throttle, it opens a valve and sends the steam down this pipe through the boiler in a superheater, and then back out and straight down to the cylinders. So a lot of people think that steam cars are very complicated to operate, but actually, in practice, and on the road, they're relatively simple. There's a few gauges This gauge is the steam pressure gauge, and it tells you the amount of steam pressure in the boiler. This gauge is the fuel pressure gauge, and it tells you the fuel pressure that's going to the burner. This small gauge down here is the oil winker, and that winks every time that the engine makes a revolution, and it tells you that oil is going to the cylinders to lubricate the valves and the pistons and the rings. Stanleys have a few valves on the dash that function for different purposes. This valve right here operates the main burner, so that's the main burner valve, and that sends fuel to the burner. This valve is a pilot valve, so it sends fuel to the pilot. The valve down here is a siphon valve, so this one would siphon water. When you open this up, it would send steam through a venturi into the water tank and suck water up out of a pond, a river, a fountain in the center of a town to resupply yourself with water. As you were driving down the road, you would stop periodically when you saw that your water tank was getting low, and you would siphon the water on board. The gauge and the valve on this side is pilot pressure. So for the pilot system, which is a separate system from the main burner, there's a pilot pressure gauge here. And this is a charging valve so that you could add more, because that system, unlike the main fuel pressure, is not maintained by the car while driving. It is just a static head of air on top of a pressurized tank of fuel. We have two valves here at the driver's, behind the driver's feet. The first valve, which is the furthest one out, is a pressure retaining valve. And what the pressure retaining valve does is it isolates the pressure from the pressure bottles of the pressurized fuel system when you're stopped and the car isn't operating, so that you don't, for whatever reason, lose pressure for the main burner. The second valve with the brass stem, this is a water bypass, and you have two. You have one on the column and you have one below your feet. This is the main bypass, this is the secondary bypass. And what they mean is, typically, if the valve is open, you would be bypassing water through the pumps, which are running as the wheel, because they run a stroke for every revolution of the wheels. It would be running back into the tanks. It would be bypassing the boiler. When you close a bypass, you force the water to go in a different direction, which is through a check valve and into the boiler. So when you needed to pump water into the boiler, you would close the bypass. When you wanted to stop sending water to the boiler, you'd open the bypass, and the bypass would circulate the water back to the tank. And the reason why you have two is because you have two water pumps. You can run with 0 pumps running, basically always bypassing. You could run this pump and have 1 pump running. But if you got into a situation where you really needed to raise the water faster, preparing for a long hill, preparing to stop the car for an extended period of time on your journey, you might want to pump up before you stop, so you'd close the secondary bypass valve, and that would force 2 pumps to pump directly into the boiler against the boiler check valves. On a Stanley, you have to have a way of telling how much water is in the boiler, not only how much steam pressure you have, but you have to make sure you have water, because if you don't have water in the boiler, you have a system where you scorch the boiler and it damages the car, and it's a pretty severe, and it's almost like blowing the engine in a car, if you will. So Stanley had a system with a water glass tube here, and this is what's called an indirect reading glass. And what that means is that Stanley was concerned not to have steam pressure at these high pressures in the cockpit with the passengers. So they invented a system to read the water based on the way that water expands when it's heated. And they had a system on the other side of the firewall, safely away from the driver, that would raise and lower the water level in here in relationship to the water that was in the boiler. So when the water level in the boiler was high, this gauge read low, and when the water in the boiler was low, this gauge would read high. So it was a safety device in 2 ways. One, it was a safety device to tell you how much water was in the boiler. 2, it kept pressure out of the cockpit, which was a concern. The big gauge here is a modern implement. They were around, But back in the day, they did not have them that handled the pressure that this car would normally operate on, which is about 450 to 500 psi. This is a direct reading glass, so this is a direct window on the boiler, if you will. So there's a very heavy borosilicate glass lens or mirror window, and the water that's in there is under the pressure of the water in the boiler. So you are literally seeing a column of water that is exactly where the water is in the boiler at any given time. And in modern times, we're able to do that, and it's a great safety feature, and it makes most drivers feel more comfortable to have that instead of sort of running by this blind system, which you had to have faith in. But both systems are certainly valid systems for checking the water. An original Stanley would just have this small column. Today we put this gauge in for safety and convenience of the operators. This handle is connected to the hand pumps. This car has two hand pumps along with the power pumps. One of the hand pumps is a water pump. The water pump is only used when you needed to pump water if you were low in water on the boiler and you didn't have a hose to fill it at the beginning of the day, or if you were under steam and you had low water and you did not want to fire the car for fear of scorching the boiler, so you would hand pump water into the system. There's a small valve underneath here that you would open, and you could pump water to the boiler at a very slow rate, but you could override, you know, the problem of firing the boiler if you felt that you did not have enough water in your gauge. The front pump on this car is the fuel pump, and that pump will hand pump fuel pressure. So if you're sitting firing up your car and you're using pressure because you're firing the car up and the wheels aren't turning, you needed to have a way to maintain the fuel pressure to a reasonable level. And you would do that using this hand pump. So somebody would sit in the car and occasionally stroke the handle to make sure that the fuel pressure stayed up. Once the car is running and down the road, it is no longer necessary to hand pump the car usually for any reason, because there's power pumps underneath the floorboards that take over and maintain the pressure to the preset pressure that you determine, you know, when you set up the car. The plate on the kickboard is a patent plate, and what that represents is at the point that this car was built, all of the patents that were issued to the Stanley Motor Carriage Company for their innovative systems that make the car go down the road. The pedal on the outboard side of the driver's compartment is the service brake. Originally, it was a brake that operated on the rear wheels on drums, and it is a mechanical brake. Today we have hydraulic brakes retrofitted on the car for safety, which provide much better stopping power in modern traffic. The two pedals that are toward the center of the cockpit control the direction of the automobile. This car has Stevenson link valve linkage in the engine which controls the valves, and by reversing the valves, you can go in reverse. So if you press these pedals all the way to the floor, they go to reverse. When they're in this position, your car would be running in the forward direction. So the engine is direct drive, there is no transmission, there's nothing to shift. So in that sense, it's more simplified than most gas cars. The reason that there's two pedals is because if you press the inner pedal slightly, it pushes the pair of pedals into a notch just past forward, which shortens the stroke of the engine, allowing you to conserve steam. So it's still running in the forward direction, but it's at a reduced amount of steam getting to the cylinder. So it's a sort of an efficiency thing. It's something that's common on trains, and other steam-powered cars have things that are similar to this as well. But it's something that we use in practice. So if you wanted full power, full stroke of the valves, it'd be all the way back. If you wanted to, once you get rolling with the car, you'd press the inner pedal, and it's almost like having second gear. A lot of people don't realize that steam cars actually run on fuels. So we have kerosene in this copper tank. The kerosene is cut in this application. It's cut by about 10% with unleaded gasoline. So this tank is not pressurized. It's just a copper fuel tank. The fuel is pumped through the system, then back into these two small bottles, which are pressurized. This is what forces the fuel to the burner at, in this car 120 psi of fuel pressure. So we send the fuel to the front of the car under pressure from these bottles. The original starting point for the fuel is this non-pressurized tank, which was an innovation for Stanley that they did this. It's a safety feature that Stanley cars particularly had, because the pressurized fuel tank was such a large amount of fuel in a car that's on fire would be dangerous. Whereas these small heavy tanks are pretty indestructible and safe, and obviously far away from the flame that might be up front in the burner, which is also sealed. So, but that's a Stanley innovation that is something that was reflected on those patent plates on the front of the car. So the passenger side of this car is really the entry point for the driver and the passenger. There's an emergency brake that's in the way and the steering wheel. So for most people, they find that it's easier to get in on the passenger side of the car. The rear passenger certainly can get into the mother-in-law seat at the back from either side. But what you do have on this side of the car are two important features of the car. The first is obviously there's a toolbox, and early cars like this needed to have tools carried along with them because there was always an adjustment to make. There was always a tool that was needed, and so toolboxes were a standard item on Stanleys and most early cars of this era. The copper tank on the side of the car is a pilot fuel tank. So this is a pressurized copper tank. What we're burning in this is Coleman lantern fluid. It runs a system at about 15 to 20 pounds that pressurizes fuel to a pilot burner in the front of the car, which is inside the burner. This would not be on a 1910 car in 1910 livery. This tank was an accessory that Stanley sold in about 1914, and they had a kit basically that went on earlier cars like this 1910, which greatly improved it. Originally, the pilot would run on the same pressure as the main fuel and the same fuel. They then decided to use a lighter fuel in the pilot. They decided to separate the system and run it at a lower pressure, and this accessory was made available, and it's widely seen on steamers that are operating today.